introduce myself again. I'm Simone Ahrens. I am a systems specialist in engineering and training, and I've been here about 1.5 years. And that's just a little bit about me before I get started. And well, I'll be talking to you guys about how to build a new parameter. So there are multiple reasons to build a new parameter. Based on your configuration, you might already have a parameter that is confusing to you, so you might need to set up a new one. So you could set up a different equation, or exclude startup and shutdown, or include missing data substitution, or change the validity of a parameter in a channel. So I'm just going to brush over the settings in a new parameter, and at least the pertinent ones. And a pro tip before I get started is, if you hover over a setting in a new parameter, if you don't remember what the setting does, if you hover over it and you give it a second, it should pop up with a description of that setting. Unfortunately, when you do that, the setting will go away after a few seconds. It's kind of annoying, but if you hover over it again, it should give you a quick description of what it does, and it should remind you what that setting does. So first, you go over to the left pane, and under Sources, you'll hit Parameters. And it'll take you to a page listing your parameters. And if you want to add this new parameter, you go to the top of the screen. You'll find a little green plus button. Hit that, and it'll pop up with a few settings you need to start off with. And you'll have to fill in the name. You don't have to fill in the description. You also have to fill in the source, and it's also helpful to put in the unit of measure. You don't have to click Create a Data Controller. You can always do that later if you don't need the data controller channel right away. So you can leave that on. I like to leave it blank first and determine exactly which channel number I need to use. Because sometimes I don't remember what channel number is available. Once you do that, the first thing you'll notice is there should be a little red X on the certification date. You need to fill that in, otherwise you won't be able to save it. You'll usually get an error. There are going to be multiple settings here that will have a red X when you alter the configuration, and if you have that red X, then you won't be able to save. Anyways, this certification date is important because it is the date that the monitoring system for the parameter was certified. So when you include this parameter in process now, it'll only look ahead of that certification date in terms of validity. And we need to make sure that that's checked and as accurate as possible. Now, another important setting is a QA enabled, and I look at it as this parameter is going to be included in the EDR for reporting purposes. Now, it doesn't have to be, but if you do, you can only have one QA enabled parameter per parameter group, depending on the type of parameter. Now, depending on the purpose of this parameter, you'll need to go over to the equation settings and include your equation, whatever it might be. But an important thing to remember is, if you want to include that equation, you have to click Has Equation first. Otherwise, if you type the equation first and then click Has Equation, it'll just go away when you go to a different tab. So it's important to hit Has Equation and then type in the equation. Oh, and also make sure that you have the equation, the equal sign at the end of the equation, not the beginning. Now, if you're plugging in this new equation, and you're probably going to need that parameter calculated. So you're going to have to verify that the parameter is actually getting calculated and processed now. Now, it depends on what sequence it is, but when you go into the sequence and you look for the task or the process now task that is supposed to be calculating this parameter, you want to make sure it's included under the correct source, and it's included in the parameters tab. Now, another thing that's important to remember is the arguments in the parameters task. If you have three different arguments you have here, -L, -C, and -O. The -O will make sure that that parameter is calculated. Because if you have the -C, that means excuse me, that means cascade. So it won't actually calculate that parameter, but it will calculate everything downstream of that parameter. So if it's a constituent of another parameter, it will calculate that parameter, not the selected parameter itself. I know it's confusing, but it's important to just put the -O so that you're sure that that calculated parameter is included. The -L means that it will include the logger channels. If you don't have the -L, it'll only do the central parameters only. That means the parameters that are not in the logger. And there's the -O to remember where to put it and to make sure it's included in your process now sequence and calculated correctly. Now, if you're concerned about the validity of this parameter, you'll go over to the Part 75 settings. It starts off empty, and you'll notice that at the top, it doesn't show here, but at the top you'll have, it'll show N for no Part 75 settings checked. Well, if you check or fill in something in this section, then that Part 75 settings will become true and be changed to a Y. Now, a few things that are important to remember are if you check a certain setting, then others will pop up with the red X indicating that you need to fill in those settings as well. For example, you could select missing data enabled. If you do that, then you have to select PMA enabled as well. You also have to include a missing data approach. It just depends on what parameter you're dealing with here, but for example, you could choose a load-based missing data approach. So that's an example of selecting something that will pop up with another setting that needs to be filled in as well. Another example is accumulate. If you put accumulate, you can't select accumulate yearly as well. You need to make sure that only one of those is selected, so you've got the vice versa there. Now, a noteworthy thing to remember here is that you don't have to fill in the QA certification date. It's not like the certification date in the base settings where you can't save the parameter unless you fill in that certification date. This one, even though it's important, it just depends on the parameter, but if it's QA enabled, it is likely that you need to fill in the certification date. Here's an example of some of the settings that need to be included when you hit missing data enabled. Now, if you go over to the calibration settings, and if your parameter is being calibrated, then you'll need to select calibrated, and you need to check that. It's similar to the equation settings predicament where if you fill in the values underneath calibrated without checking it, and then you check calibrated, they won't stick. So you'll need to select calibrated first before you fill in the corresponding values. Now here, another thing to remember is if you fill in the primary calibration error calculation type, that's a mouthful, then you need to make sure that that's consistent with the calibration sequence that you configured with this parameter. So if they're not configured, then StackStudio might throw fits or you'll get some validity issues. So you want to make sure that this is consistent with what is configured in the calibration sequence. Here's an example of what needs to be filled in. It's important to fill in the span value and at least 2 of the calibration points. Now if you go over to the next tab, this is the reason code and action code settings. Now you can leave these blank, you don't need to fill them in. However, if you do choose to fill them in, you'll have to fill in the top 3, the normal reason code, the invalid reason code, and the exceedance reason code. If you only fill in 1, you're going to get the red X's again, and you can't save if you don't have those filled in. So the coding is important too. When you're reporting a particular parameter that goes invalid for some reason, you need to code that correctly for this parameter, and that's where this setting comes in. You can make custom codes, but you need to make sure that you apply those custom codes in this tab. Again, I'm Simone Ahrens. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.